Hi, all. I'm finally
Hey,
there.
Rebecca. Welcome.
Thanks.
Welcome, everyone. I'll give everyone a minute or two to join, and then we'll get started. All right, why don't we go ahead and get started? Hello, and on behalf of the Center for Democracy and Technology, or CDT, thank you for joining us today. My name is Samir Jain, and I'm the Vice President of Policy here at CDT. For those of you not familiar with CDT, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization fighting to advance civil rights and civil liberties in the digital age. Established in 1994, CDT has been a trusted advocate for digital rights since the earliest days of the internet, including specifically in the area of elections and democracy, which, as our name suggests, has been central to our mission throughout. Today's event is focused on our just released report, Seismic Shifts: How Economic, Technological, and Political Trends Are Challenging Independent Counter-Election Disinformation Initiatives. The report focuses on how election disinformation research initiatives work in practice and describes the growing challenges researchers face in their work. It makes the case that immediate steps must be taken to protect counter-disinformation research and recommends new approaches for researchers to carry out their important work. This report comes as we are closing in on 2024, a year in which elections in the United States, along with other key votes around the world, will occur during arguably one of the worst times for political disinformation that we've ever seen, as political, technological, and economic shifts are combining to create a challenging environment for election officials, researchers, and advocates. We are fortunate to be joined by a stellar panel to discuss some of these challenges and ways in which researchers can play an essential role in addressing them and thereby protecting our democracy. So let me begin by briefly introducing them. First, Dr. Rebecca Trumbull is Associate Professor in the School of Media and Public Affairs and Director of the Institute for Data Democracy and Politics at the George Washington University. Her research focuses on political communication, digital research methodology, and research ethics, with a particular interest in political discourse on social media, as well as the spread and impact of online misinformation. Dr. Trumbull consults regularly for policymakers across Europe and the US on topics of digital platform accountability, responsible data use, and best practices for combating the effects of mis and disinformation. Katie Harbath is the founder and CEO of Anchor Change, where she helps clients navigate the landscape of tech policy, especially as it relates to global issues such as democracy, elections, and civic engagement online. She spent more than 10 years as a public policy director at Facebook, where, among other things, she built and led the teams that managed elections and government outreach across the world. She currently serves as a senior advisor for technology and democracy at the International Republican Institute and is a fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center, the Integrity Institute, and the Atlantic Council. Dean Jackson is currently the principal at Public Circle Research and Consulting. He has more than a decade of research experience at the intersection of democracy, media, and technology, most recently at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Dean also served as an investigative analyst for the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack, where he was responsible for the congressional inquiry into social media policy. And finally, Will Adler was until recently, and at the time of the writing of this report, the senior technologist in elections and democracy here at CDT, where he worked to ensure that American elections are fair, accessible, and secure. Before joining CDT, Will worked on tech issues in the office of U.S. Senator Elizabeth Warren, and he also worked at the Princeton Gerrymandering Project, advancing the causes of redistricting reform and open election data. He also is probably one of the few election experts with a PhD in neuroscience. So we are lucky to have a fantastic panel of speakers to discuss today's topic. We'll also have time at the end to address audience questions, so I encourage you to submit those at any time using the Q&A function in Zoom. Let's dive in and begin with Dean and Will, the two primary authors of the Seismic Shifts report, who will provide an overview of the report's findings and recommendations. Gentlemen.
So thanks, Samir. I'll just start with a little bit of talking about why we did this project to do some table setting here. So I worked at CDT from fall 2020 until last month. And for much of that time, I was thinking about this project and doing research for it. And it ultimately expanded in scope to the point where we had Danielle Dugal, a Google Policy Fellow, and Dean brought on to join me and Samir in this project. And the project began in the wake of the 2020 election, which we all know saw the proliferation of various false narratives about the electoral process. And in March 2021, the Election Integrity Partnership, or the EIP, released its report on the narratives that they observed in the 2020 election and the ways that they saw those narratives develop, be shared, and migrate across platforms. In 2020, it was a collaboration between groups at Stanford, the University of Washington, Graphica, and the Atlantic Council's DFR lab. But it also supported information exchange between those researchers, some government officials, civil society organizations, and representatives of some of the social media platforms. And one thing that was really interesting to me was not only their findings, but the system that they set up to do their work. They set up a ticketing system so that participants could identify and track election-related content that could be false or misleading. And a ticket might be a single post or an entire website dedicated to election falsehoods. Now, it's important to understand that election disinformation spreads at a key time when people are voting. So it's really important to make sure that all relevant stakeholders can have eyes on possible misinformation as it spreads in real time. So election officials need to know about misinformation that might be affecting voters in their jurisdictions, making them less likely to vote at all, or to lose trust in their election officials or in the election system, or even to threaten their election officials. Platforms need to be aware of content that might violate their policies, and members of civil society should be aware of narratives that are designed to mislead voters, say, of a particular race or ethnicity, so that they can counter message reliable information to those communities. And it struck me that the kind of approach that EIP took not only had the benefit of helping researchers track disinformation for academic purposes, but also provided a window for a number of other stakeholders, pointing towards the possibility of a more whole of society approach towards election disinformation and the way that it can harm democracy. So we started this project as a way of exploring this idea. How might multi-stakeholder partnerships like the EIP be a model of enhancing transparency about harmful narratives that spread on the internet, or creating a more open discussion about how to engage in content moderation without harming free expression online? And how do we get more eyes on narratives from people who are closer to the communities that are affected by disinformation? So that was kind of the idea. We wanted to explore whether this EIP-like approach was something that could or should be emulated or expanded. And we identified a number of other groups in the US and around the world doing similar work to identify and mitigate election disinformation in real time. And we tried to interview them as well as their partners at the platforms to identify the challenges they faced. And we ultimately ended up interviewing over 30 people. And while we were working on this, some of these researchers and partnerships went from being, more or less outside observers of the electoral process to being thrust into the political spotlight. So in 2022, a House Judiciary Subcommittee started focusing a lot of attention on the EIP in particular for their role in 2020, leveling accusations that these researchers were part of a plot to censor conservatives on the internet. People who we interviewed found that these accusations have made it harder for these partnerships to operate and may drive young researchers from the field. Some of the people we interviewed, even at various points, feared for their personal safety and were driven from their homes. So our report focuses on a few of these partnerships, the different approaches that they take to the problem, and we also focused on the variety of challenges that they are increasingly facing as we go into the 2024 election season. And I'll hand it to Dean to describe what we found.
Thanks, Will. So everybody, as you know, I'm Dean Jackson. I'm another author on this report, along with Will and Samir. And I'm just going to talk more about our findings and then our recommendations before we dive into the panel discussion. So as we were interviewed, all these 30 people, we started to think that the greatest commonalities between all of these counter-election disinformation efforts might be actually their growing challenges. Our findings left me feeling personally somewhat pessimistic because the most prevalent approaches for countering election disinformation in 2020 might struggle to be sustainable in 2024. And the 2024 elections could end up being the most vulnerable US elections since 2016. And the reasons why I think can be grouped into three major trends that we outline in the report. The first has to do with changes in the technology sector. Tens of thousands of layoffs in social media companies have made communication with researchers more difficult as key teams are cut or reduced. But many of the frustrations in relationships between platforms and researchers predate those layoffs. It's possible to overstate the impact of the layoffs, even though they are serious and they do have an impact. Interview subjects pointed out that the majority of content reported to platforms by some of these research initiatives has gone unresponded to or unactioned. And sometimes when action is taken, it only comes after significant press coverage pressures someone into action. And even if these relationships did work better, it's always worth pointing out that rumors do most of their damage in the initial hours and sometimes days after they're spread, which is well before outside groups have time to find and report that content into platforms. Policy changes at platforms since 2020 have also frustrated relationships between them and counter-disinformation professionals. Since the midterm elections, Meta, YouTube, and the platform formerly known as Twitter have all walked back policies against denying the results of the 2020 elections. And meanwhile, those same denials are fueling a wave of voter suppression and election administration changes that are jeopardizing future contests across the country. Since Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter, that company's been at the forefront of these trends. Its cuts and reversals are often later imitated by other companies. And Twitter and Musk's management there brings us to the second set of challenges, which is the growing political backlash around this work, some of which Will laid out for you. Many of the researchers that we spoke with feared that between Musk's release of the Twitter files, hearings in the House of Representatives, and ongoing court cases, that the atmosphere around their work might become unsustainably toxic, which would jeopardize their relationships between government researchers and platforms even further. In July, these fears were made manifest by an injunction in the case of Missouri v. Biden, which barred the government from interfacing with platforms or independent researchers around content moderation. Now, that injunction has since been overturned, but the fact it was made based in part on statements inaccurately attributed to researchers shows how disinformation about disinformation research is affecting that field. Despite the injunction's reversal, many people fear that the rising political risk around this work will scare institutions like government agencies, foundations, and universities away from supporting the important work of protecting US elections from disinformation. And at the extreme end of this trend, as Will said, there are the serious risks and safety threats that some professionals have faced following public criticism of their work. Now, these challenges come at a time when new technologies are emerging on the scene, especially I'm thinking here of generative AI. I don't think that will be a surprise to anyone, but this is the sort of third trend that we lay out in the report. Generative AI's impact on the 2024 election is obviously yet to be seen. It's a future event. And on the one hand, it seems certain that it will make production of disinformation easier. On the other hand, the main challenge for disinformation purveyors has always been on distributing the content that they make. It's also uncertain whether or not, or to what degree, the content created by AI will prove more persuasive than previous forms of disinformation. This is definitely an area to watch. The technology is proceeding more quickly than the safeguards, as often happens, and it's coming right up into an election year. So this will certainly be something to continue to look out for. So to sum up, as I said, this is something of a pessimistic forecast. Many of the researchers in this field came out of 2020 feeling that their work with platforms had limited impact, even in better conditions. Things are harder now, but there are ways that researchers can adapt, and we lay out some of those in the report. First and most immediately, institutions need to protect researchers doing this work. This might mean either producing lists of lawyers who are willing to represent them pro bono in court or in front of congressional committees. It might mean a shared fund to defray those legal costs. It could also mean a more proactive, fleshed out public relations playbook for institutions that are caught in this crossfire. Many of the people we spoke with were frustrated that old risk-averse PR approaches are ill-suited for responding to sustained adversarial media campaigns. And they told us that you can no longer hunker down and wait for a bad news cycle to blow over, and that the sooner you respond, the more control of the narrative you'll ultimately have. Second, researchers seem more bullish on counter-messaging, public outreach, and other efforts to work with election officials. They seem more bullish on these things than they do about the future of efforts to shape platform policy. They're not giving up on tech accountability, and some of them really stress that. That's still very important. But they're looking for areas where they might have more traction and more short-term impact for 2024. Looking down the line, another of these areas might be advocacy to state governments. California is blazing ahead on tech regulation. Similar reforms could be pursued in key swing states. Just because there's gridlock at the federal level doesn't mean there's no possibility for movement anywhere. Third, another suggestion is for researchers to broaden their aperture and think about how disinformation works in combination with structural factors like the two-party system, or our first past the post primary system, or the redistricting system at the state level, and how disinformation combines with these non-digital structural elements of our society to deepen division and accelerate radicalism. Fourth, another thing we can do is make sure our own counter-disinformation efforts are more transparent in order to increase public trust and ward off accusations of censorship. While much of the narrative around the Twitter files and Missouri v. Biden is based on untrue claims or misconstrued evidence, some of the people we spoke with were sympathetic to the idea that there should be more safeguards here, that the risk of censorship, while not evident in past events, is a future concern worth thinking through. And so rules requiring disclosure of communications about content moderation between government and platforms could be very helpful there and may be appropriate. And finally, I think this may go without saying, but we shouldn't give up. Tech platforms should reinvest in trust and safety and reinstate policies around election rumors. Foundations should avoid the temptation to scale back funding for election integrity. Universities should continue to support their researchers, and government officials should continue to protect elections. Democracy is simply too precious and too vulnerable to easily surrender this early in the fight.
Great. Thanks, Dean and Will, for that overview. So now I want to go ahead and dive in. As Dean noted, the report discusses several trends that are raising challenges for election disinformation research. And I wanted to start by diving into those trends a little bit more. First, on the platform side, as Dean noted, the platforms have undergone layoffs due to economic pressures, including particularly in the trust and safety area. There are also some indications that for political and other reasons, platforms may be less willing to take action against disinformation going forward in the election context. So Katie, why don't I begin with you? What's your assessment of where platforms are in their willingness and ability to address election disinformation?
Yeah, thank you. And first, just thank you so much for having me and for writing the report. I like to describe where the platforms are right now kind of as a kaleidoscope rather than a spectrum of where they are on politics, because you're right. There are a lot, each of the platforms are kind of taking different approaches to this. And I think it's important to look at both the legacy platforms, your Facebooks, your Googles. We'll put Twitter and X in its whole own category right now. But there's a lot of newer platforms that are having to face and think about these challenges for the first time. This is going to be the first election that TikTok is as prominent as it has been. You have Discord, you have Twitch, you have all of these Twitter clones from Blue Sky to Pebble, which used to be T2 and Post News. You also have Substack that has come out and said they want 2024 to be known as the Substack election. But then you also have platforms that are, and so they're kind of taking all different sorts of approaches to this. I do want to say, so there is a lot to be concerned about, and I think we need to separate this out in a couple of different ways. One is the company's actual policies, and what it is that they are or not going to enforce against. And I think one thing that is important for folks to remember is that these policies are going to kind of stay living and breathing things. So there was a lot of stories around how YouTube and Meta and others were no longer going to enforce on content that said that 2020 was fraudulent, right? That doesn't mean they're not going to do something different for 2024. So we should expect that as things continue to evolve over the next 13, 15 months, that the platform policies might as well. The second question is, how well can they enforce on those policies? Where are they reactive enforcing on them versus where are they proactive? How accurate are they in trying to proactively find this violating content? This is a big open question in terms of those layoffs and the trust and safety workers on the product side, the policy side, et cetera, of how many people there are, not just to handle elections here in the US, but remember, this next year is the biggest year of elections we've ever seen around the globe. So you're going to have India, Indonesia, Taiwan, maybe Ukraine, Mexico, and the European Parliament all happening likely in the beginning half of next year when our primaries are happening. Overall, there's 65 national level elections across 54 countries that I'm monitoring as a part of all of this. And so it's important to not only look at what's happening in the US, but also overseas. I'm also keeping an eye on where platforms are helping people to still get information about where, when, and how to vote. I'll be looking at, the European Union just launched their DSA Transparency Center today. Some of the reports on code of practice are coming out today. What's happening in Europe? Is that going to impact here in the United States? I'm watching political advertising. Some places have banned them, like TikTok. Twitter's decided to reopen them. Meta and Google still allow them, though, albeit with a lot of restrictions. So there's a lot of different aspects that I'm watching in terms of platforms. The last thing I'll just say is that, to kind of where Dean was at as well, all hope is not lost. Platforms are still doing work in this space. I talk to people every single day inside the platforms that are doing this work. And we should also separate out, where is the C-suite and how much resources they are giving, and where are their values and what decisions are they making? And what are the frontline workers who are doing this work day in and day out, alongside with those outside platforms like researchers and others who are doing what they can with the resources that they have? And how do we continue to help them and try to advocate for them to continue to get more of the resources that they need?
Great, thanks. Rebecca, why don't I bring you into this conversation? Let's focus a little bit, sort of given the trends that Katie has talked about, what do you think are the best ways for researchers to be engaging with platforms? Is it to provide them information about disinformation? Is it more public pressure? Is it trying to get access to data for research? What do you think are the more constructive ways for researchers to be engaging with platforms now?
The short answer is option D, all of the above. This has always been the case, right? It is, and for a little bit of context for folks, right? I have personally, right, been a researcher who has been engaged in this full suite of options, partnering directly with the platforms on certain research projects. Certainly talking to platform personnel about all of these issues, working with policymakers, including those in Europe who shaped the Digital Services Act and the requirement for the mandated access, or the requirement for mandated access to data, platform data for researchers. I have also co-founded the Coalition for Independent Tech Research to, from outside, place direct pressure on the platforms to respond to all of these things. We can't really hope to make any progress by just limiting ourselves to one of these tactics. It really takes an all hands on deck and all options open approach to this. What I will say, and building on something that Katie was pointing to at the end, right, when Katie, you were asking the question about what impact will Europe have on this, if it weren't for Europe right now, I think that I would feel pretty defeated and despondent in this moment. It has certainly become much, much more difficult for outside researchers to do the sorts of the options that you list, Samir, to actually engage directly with people at the platforms, because there's simply fewer of them, right? We spent literally years building up relationships with good folks at all of these platforms who are trying to do the right thing. And for the most part, they're gone, right? It's really, really difficult to know who to reach out to, who to work with. If it weren't for the European Union and the Digital Services Act, I don't know that we'd have much hope of rectifying that situation at all. But given the sort of requirements that for performing risk assessments, for sharing more transparent information with the public, and crucially for sharing data with researchers, I do think that we still have some options for leverage to continue the work that we've been doing. And hopefully, ultimately, that leads to a sort of restaffing of some of these positions, increased focus again, as the DSA begins to come into force and the platforms feel the real pressure of actual enforcement action. I honestly think that's about 6 to 12 months away. It's maybe not going to fix things in time for the early elections that Katie mentioned next year. Is there some hope that it will help with later elections in 2024? Yes. But honestly, I think it's beyond 2024 where we have the greatest amount of hope and possibility.
Will, you want to weigh in on the platform side of things before we move to other topics? Anything? Okay. So Dean, let me turn to you. You mentioned the Missouri versus Biden case, where the plaintiffs are arguing that government interactions with platforms and even with researchers violate the First Amendment because they effectively involve indirect censorship by the government. As you noted, the district court entered a really wide-ranging injunction. The Fifth Circuit narrowed it, but still kept an injunction in place, at least as to some of the parties. And now it's actually pending in the Supreme Court, at least in terms of whether or not that injunction should be stayed or let it go into effect. Now, I mean, the case raises the issue of what is the proper role of the government in addressing disinformation and government job owning of social media platforms. How should the government be able to engage, and when might the government go too far and potentially raise these kinds of First Amendment concerns? Dean, why don't you start by elaborating a bit?
Yeah, it's a great question and an active and live debate. You use this word jawboning, which I think is new to a lot of us as of this year, but has gained a lot of prominence. And there's a long kind of history of law around this idea of jawboning, or the sort of government use of authority to sort of bully or cajole private actors into taking certain actions related to speech, especially constitutionally protected speech. And where the law sort of boils down to is this unresolved tension between coercion and persuasion. The government has a right to attempt to persuade private actors, including social media companies, to change their speech, to take certain policies or steps, or to not engage in certain types of speech. What it doesn't have the right to do is to sort of unduly coerce, to engage in that type of behavior. And so there's a legitimate interest in having the government interact with social media platforms. The question before the courts is, did that stray into coercion? And I think the Fifth Circuit reversal of that injunction, which did limit it, kept part of it, but significantly revised the restrictions that the injunction put in place. It kind of right-sized things, right? First off, the initial injunction forbid the government from talking to independent research groups like the ones we cover in the report. Those groups also have First Amendment rights. They have a right to speak to their government around these issues. I think that was very evidently a bridge too far, and the courts ultimately found that too. It also waded through like which agencies and which parts of the government have the most appropriate handholds here. And if you look at the case law around jawboning, which is something I've been looking into recently, you start to see a series of distinctions take place, right? The executive has just different interests than in different maybe privileges than the legislature. I think the Fifth Circuit ruling was most skeptical of people directly in the White House reaching out to companies, but within law enforcement agencies or within public health agencies, they found there's a more permissive relationship between platforms and the government, right? Especially when you look at things like platforms reaching out to public health officials to get their expertise on how to respond to a pandemic, right? That's actually a really healthy relationship and something you wouldn't want to prohibit. I think you also have to think about in the legislature, legislators don't have enforcement power, right? And so it might look different when they communicate with platforms and say, you need to take care of this problem or we're going to do X, because they are trying to figure out what the rules should look like. and they need to be able to communicate the seriousness of their concerns. At the same time, it shouldn't be tied to specific acts of speech, right? Because they shouldn't be able to use that bully pulpit to coerce platforms into taking stuff down. I also think it matters whether or not the statements are made in public or private, right? If and this gets back to our transparency recommendation. In a public letter from a legislator, the public is also an audience. It can be a signal to the electorate. In a private letter, it could look much more like a threat, right? And these are all questions I think courts have to look at when they make decisions about whether or not individual government acts stack up to coercion. I haven't seen much coming out of the Twitter files or the House hearings or these court cases that I think stacks up to coercion. It seems like the courts largely agree with that, but you could imagine how it could happen. And we even have sort of proto examples, right? The executive order during the Trump administration attempting to roll back Section 230 protections for the platforms following the decision to label the president's posts about the Black Lives Matter protests in May of 2020. I think that looks a lot like a reprisal, right? And so the model is there. It's not that difficult to imagine that this could stray too far out ahead, which is why I think it's sensible to just sort of create some rules so that there's public insight into the process to make sure this doesn't happen in the future, even if we don't have current great examples of it happening now.
Rebecca, did you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, just a quick note to say that the contours of the Missouri v. Biden case have been incredibly odd. So, as Dean, you pointed out, we've got this, what until yesterday was the latest ruling from the Fifth Circuit, right, that basically walked back most of the injunction. And I totally agree with you, with your analysis, that it seemed to really pinpoint the key elements where indeed the government's action may have been coercive, and focus on those and walk back everything else. But literally as of yesterday, the Fifth Circuit has said that they are willing to rehear the injunction that was imposed on the government interaction, the Biden administration interacting with researchers like those in the Election Integrity Project, like myself, theoretically, in a way that, I'm just going to put it boldly, feels bananas to me. Just minutes ago, we learned that the Solicitor General responded to the Fifth Circuit's agreement to rehear this case and said that was done entirely improperly. So now the Fifth Circuit has sort of pseudo walked that back. It is really, really, really difficult to follow all of the ins and outs and what sort of feels like hijinks with this case. And that really speaks to the larger field, the larger sense of uncertainty that researchers who are doing this work and have really dedicated themselves to trying to do this work in the public interest are feeling. It's a really, really great weight because, we're feeling these attacks, but we're also feeling the weight of the uncertainty. At one minute, it feels like you know what you can do, who you can engage with, and the next second that's being completely yanked back, and we just don't know where things are going.
Yeah, so another reason for all of this uncertainty, as you've rightly identified, Rebecca, is the political and legal attacks that researchers are facing. So one example of that is the investigation by the House, in which researchers have been subpoenaed and incurred significant legal costs, and face a lot of threats, both rhetorical and political. Katie, to what degree do you think all of this is having a chilling effect on election research and the willingness of election researchers to continue on in this space?
Yeah, I think that from what I've heard, listen, it's having a chilling effect, but there's also a great resilience within this community determined to try to find a way forward. And I think that is important to think about as we continue to move forward, to make sure that they continue to have that support in which to do this work and how we think about this. And I just want to say two things on top of that. One, to what Dean said, in all of this, I think there's some very valid questions about what the right role of government should be in these types of situations. I do think more transparency and checks and balances would be good, especially when you start to think about how this looks like with other governments around the world. We don't necessarily want a government being able to have this control, and we want the platforms to sometimes push back, and sometimes we want the government to be pushing back on them. And so I think we need to have, again, transparency and oversight is going to be really big on this. So there's valid questions, but I absolutely loathe the way at which people are going about this. These are real people. They have faced real harassment. They have been chased from their homes. They are losing their jobs. The trust, it is not just the chilling effect on the research and election official community. It is a chilling effect on the trust and safety community. I am hearing every single day, there are a lot of people who are having to make the choice right now, whether they want to continue in this work or not. And man, is it really hard to motivate them in which to do so. Second of all, is it's not just the political situation, and it's not just Missouri v. Biden. We also have a series of Supreme Court cases that are also going to be heard and decided in the middle of all of these election years. So you're having one, the Supreme Court will be hearing about whether or not government officials can ban people from engaging with them on their accounts. Those arguments will be on October 31st. I think the Supreme Court, according to Daphne Keller, but it could be wrong, but I think the Supreme Court's meeting today and potentially could decide they're going to hear Texas and the Florida content moderation cases, which could also happen. And then it's very likely Missouri v. Biden also goes to the court. So all of this uncertainty also adds to the chilling effect for this entire community.
So Rebecca, Katie rightly points out these are real people who are being affected. What advice do you have for researchers in particular about how to address some of these risks and uncertainties they're facing? And what kind of support should their institutions and others be providing to them?
So I'm particularly glad that you asked that second question. I want to start there. We have for far too long treated the problem of researcher or other sort of expert group harassment as an individual problem, right? As something that these individuals need to take on and face themselves. And it's their responsibility. We want to encourage them to be resilient, but we put the onus on them to achieve that resilience. We are to a point now where whether it's trust and safety workers, researchers, journalists reporting on this, the election officials themselves, right, who are being harassed, we can no longer tolerate this being an individual level problem, right, or the onus, the responsibility being placed on the individuals. So, I call on institutions, first and foremost, funders in this area, first and foremost, to recognize that it is the work, this is it is an occupational hazard. It is the work itself that puts these folks at risk. And so the institutions can do things from, right, very small measures like paying for these folks to have access to services like Delete Me, helping them get cybersecurity preparation before they go out and issue a new report, right? Or while they're doing the work. We need to head things off, plan ahead, and it shouldn't be on the individuals themselves to go and take care of that. Institutions can also be providing monitoring support to look for emerging threats. But even more than that, institutions need to be taking responsibility for publicly communicating that they stand behind their employees, and also for providing a variety of forms of support, including mental health care support for those who are facing these challenges. For the researchers, what I would say is there is strength in community, right? Find other people who are going through this and start a signal group, right? Talk to one another about what you're facing. The work that I've done really shows that one of the best forms of resiliency comes in that group environment. When you're talking to others who are going through this, that you're not alone. You can also learn from their experiences, plan ahead for what you need to do, figure out how you want to react when you are under attack, really draw on the strength of the larger community. And I want to underscore what Katie said just a minute ago. Yes, the community is feeling the incredible weight of this, but the resilience that I have seen is so powerful, right? We are not stepping back from this work. It is becoming harder. It is, creating incredible challenges for us, but we are determined to a person. The researchers that I talk to say, we are determined to keep doing this work.
Great, very powerful. So I do want to move us to a different part of the challenge that's going on in this space, in addition to all of the political and legal ones. and that's technological change. Dean alluded earlier to generative AI and how that might affect the information environment heading into next year. And one of our audience members also notes that it's not just a question of the increased volume of electoral disinformation, but also potentially empowering micro-targeting and more personalization of this kind of disinformation, as well as maybe diverse formats, all of which may make it that much harder to address. So, Will, why don't we begin with you? And, what do you see as the problem, as the effect of generative AI? Is it going to make it worse? Is the fear exaggerated? What's your assessment?
Yeah, so where we landed is that generative AI is just one of the many factors that's going to make the information environment in 2024 especially challenging. It's certainly a brand new factor and it's a huge unknown, but I don't think it's safe to conclude yet that it's going to completely transform the information environment. So I'm not necessarily ready to buy into that hype. But it does, indicate why it's important for platforms to not back away from protecting elections and not to move resources away from it when we have this brand new unknown in the space. Obviously, it remains to be seen how much of an impact it's going to have. One interesting distinction to make here when I think about this is the difference between foreign and domestic information operations. So, certainly the kind of foreign disinformation campaign that we saw in 2016 by the Russians was fairly clumsy in some ways, right? We had, these huge, bot armies sharing memes with terrible English that were honestly not very convincing, and their impact was debatable, and we're still debating the impact of those influence operations. Obviously, generative AI could be a huge boon to a foreign actor like that, trying to create a bot army that was more fluent in English, more culturally attuned to what voters in other countries care about, and so on. But 2020 showed the impact of domestic disinformation campaigns by well-known figures, and it's not totally clear to me yet how generative AI might boost those campaigns. Perhaps, as I think the commenter in the Q&A mentioned, perhaps disinformation chatbots proliferate that seem like authentic users. It's hard to say. That certainly could be the case, but I think it's. If you think about forums of people who follow QAnon, it's certainly possible for people to, organically engage in disinformation on their own without having to create new, disinformation chatbots to enter the space. In terms of what we've seen already, we've already seen AI generated images come up in campaigns. So the big one is DeSantis's presidential campaign, or an associated PAC, I'm not sure, used AI generated images depicting Trump, kissing Fauci, etc. And they didn't disclose the use of AI in those images. But I think for the most part, journalists are well aware, and the public is becoming more aware of the fact that text and images may be AI generated. So that should hopefully give people pause when they see extraordinary claims or extraordinary images. But does knowing that undermine the trustworthiness of all information sources everywhere, including authentic, reliable ones? It's hard to know, and it will take a lot of study and time to really understand that. One reason to feel optimistic is that the AI companies at least appear to be engaging in good faith collaborative cross-industry efforts to make sure that their models are safe and aren't producing harmful content. But we know that they don't have unlimited ability to control their actual large language models. These models are a little bit unpredictable. It's unpredictable what users will do with them. And they're also making them open source in many cases. So users can modify them to do all sorts of things. So we should, basically assume that large language models that can produce harmful content are out there and available to actors who might want to leverage them and think about ways to mitigate that. So kind of course, a cop-out answer, but we'll see.
Others have thoughts on generative AI and what it may portend?
Yeah, I kind of want to add, one of the things I've been telling people is I think we should panic responsibly when it comes to a lot of these things, particularly AI. I want to plus one everything that Will said, and also say too, that AI companies, in some ways, I feel like we've learned some of the lessons about how long it took us to pay attention to some of the bad effects of social media and starting to mitigate those. We've started much earlier in having those conversations on AI, and part of that may have been from some of those lessons learned from starting too late on that. A lot of these AI companies are thinking through what they're going to be doing for elections, what that looks like for information, and it'll be important to keep an eye on them for that. And as Will and I think others have mentioned, AI will also help us in trying to fight and combat some of these things. And so I think it's important there's going to just be a lot of factors next year. We're going to be on a roller coaster ride. And so we need to be diligent. We need to have concerns and voice those and try to think about how do we mitigate those, but also not necessarily freak out at every single thing, because I worry that it could cause us to take our eye off the ball of what is actually happening.
Okay, great. So
I haven't heard just on AI very quickly. I haven't heard anything that I disagree with. I think all of the points raised are really great. I would just add one more example to Will's list, which is we've already seen reports of Chinese government actors using AI generated imagery and a campaign around the wildfire fires in Hawaii. Didn't happen to gain much traction in that case, but it's not even 2024 yet. It's clearly already sort of being experimented with, and it'll develop quickly. So definitely worth watching.
So we've spent, we've been talking a lot about some of the challenging trends. And I want to turn to another portion of what the report talks about, which is, given all these challenges and these changes, are current approaches to election disinformation research the right approach, or are there adaptations that we think should happen, or where researchers should alter their focus to some degree? And I know the report talks about this a little bit. Dean, do you want to start us off by, some ways in which it may make sense for researchers to alter what they're focused on going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. I posed this during the research process to a few of the people we interviewed, and as tends to happen, when you first have an idea that maybe this community needs to alter its approach, you phrase it in big terms, right? Sort of dramatic action, and what happens is people walk you back, they narrow it, they tailor it, and so when I say yes, there are adaptations and alterations that should be made, I want to stress that that doesn't mean abandoning the work that's already going on, right? The work of monitoring and understanding disinformation trends and narratives is useful for all kinds of reasons. So even if it's not been especially promising at shaping platform policy, it's still useful for informing counter narratives. It's useful for understanding the threats and challenges that we do face in this space. It's useful for policy advocacy, and sometimes it does result in productive actions by the platforms. And so I think that work has to be ongoing, but we also need to recognize that is probably not going to be enough to safeguard elections next year, right? We need to do that plus, and maybe that means recalibrating the focus that we put on that work versus work like getting messages out to the public, helping election officials protect themselves, helping government officials communicate better. And then down the line, I do think that in some ways, the story of disinformation research is a bunch of disciplines coming together to all look at something new in a way that isn't well sustained just by computer science or just by social science. But in the creation of that field, it's also sort of siloed itself into this technology criticism category that maybe now needs to expand back out and think about the broader ways in which technology and digital disinformation around elections are just one part of our society and our information ecosystem. And over the long term, I do think we're going to have to think about all of the things that have led to increased rancor and division in those areas. Technology is just going to be one facet of them. We have to understand how tech affects those things, but also how those things affect tech, and focus on making progress to the extent we can on all of them. It would also be, I'll just close by saying, it would be foolhardy to discount how important the developments Rebecca noted in Europe are in late 2024 and going forward into 2025 and beyond. It may be that tech accountability research has more handles and more levers to move ahead. So that's yet to be seen, but I think there are alterations to be made. It doesn't mean abandoning the good work that's going on right now.
Becca, you're a researcher yourself and talked to a bunch of researchers as well. Do you see or do you think there are some changes in focus or alterations in approach that might be necessary?
I mean, I suspect a number of people joining us today read the Washington Post piece that came out over the weekend, relaying some of the issues that researchers have been facing, right, in the political arena, whether it's the House letters of inquiry and subpoenas that are coming their way, the Missouri v. Biden case, or other lawsuits that are being directed at them. And one of the things that the article noted is that researchers are thinking about what's the appropriate way to frame the work that they're doing, even to label the work that they're doing. And if there's any real advantage to this moment, I would argue that this provides a real opportunity for those of us who have been in this space for a number of years now. I mean, honestly, we're getting pretty close to a decade of this work. To take a step back and think a bit more critically about where our work fits in the larger landscape, given the kind of electoral integrity aims that we have, the public good work that we've all been trying to do, and ask ourselves some what will sometimes be difficult questions about how we've approached that work, how we might look at it going forward, and whether to some extent this focus particularly on things like in the early days what we called fake news, but then abandoned it because that became too politically toxic. So now we talk about mis and disinformation. Well, that feels right. The sort of overarching focus on these issues may in and of itself have created a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So this is not me saying, I want to be very careful, this is not me saying that we should abandon this work at all, but I think it does give us an opportunity to think a bit more critically about how the work fits into the larger public dialogue, the larger public conversation, right? I loved, Katie, your admonition to us to panic responsibly. I think to a certain extent, that's something that researchers need to do right now. That doesn't give us concrete answers about what the work looks like going forward. But if we can get anything, if we can find silver lining in this at all, I think that's probably where it lies.
Great. I'm going to ask one wrap-up question for the panelists, and in the interim, just remind the audience you can pose questions in the Q&A, and we'll turn to those next. But let me ask each of you just briefly to, as you think about the environment heading into 2024, what worries you the most about the ability to protect electoral integrity? What do you see as signs of optimism? What is your overall assessment at this point as to where things stand? So Katie, why don't I begin with you?
Sure. I think my biggest concern is just the sheer number of elections happening, and how we might get sucked into paying more attention to what's happening in the US and Europe and leaving the door open for places like Russia and China to continue their efforts in places like Africa and South America. And that we may wake up in 2025 not realizing how much ground they've gained in places we weren't paying attention. So that's probably my biggest concern out of a lot. What gives me hope, though, is, again, there are still a lot of people doing this work. There's still a lot of people who care. There's still a lot of momentum and effort that is going through this. I think overall, we are in the middle of redefining not only our societal norms, our legal structures, the marketplace, and what the businesses overall look like. And so it's good that we're having these conversations. It's good that we're having, we need to be having them in a constructive manner, and continuing to move forward. And that to me gives me hope, because it's not like this stuff is stopped completely. There's still a lot of work happening.
Great. Will?
So what concerns me most is the impact that disinformation has had on election officials. So there has been so much turnover in election administration in the US. We've seen way higher rates of retirements of experienced election officials across the country. And that makes me really concerned, because it raises the prospect that there's going to be a new wave of election workers and election officials who have less experience, who will make more mistakes, which will gin up more narratives about elections being rigged, which will then drive, further exits. I'm kind of worried about this vicious cycle, because election workers do make mistakes, and there are technical problems with every single election. There's something like 8 to 10,000 different election jurisdictions across the US. They're all using different equipment. They all have different procedures. Things go wrong all the time. And but the question is, are those mistakes able to be caught and corrected quickly, or do they become these false narratives that the election was rigged in some way? So that's the thing that worries me most: honest errors blowing up into these bigger narratives. The thing that gives me optimism, though, is that journalists know so much more about the electoral process than they used to. I think 2020 and COVID and the shift to mail-in voting and all the questions that raised for the public was an incredibly educational process for journalists, approaching what like 2000 was. I've seen so many incredible explanatory pieces on the electoral process, which can be so complicated. And also, when things came up in 2022, there were various errors, say in Arizona with the printers. Journalists were able to sort of explain that stuff incredibly quickly, which I think is such an important part of the process. So that's one thing that makes me optimistic about the resilience of our information environment.
Great. Rebecca.
I can be pretty short because Will shared my concern, my number one concern about election workers. And for those who haven't caught it yet, there was a new report that came out from issue 1 today that showed that in a number of US states, more than half of election officials have resigned since 2020. It is a deep and profound concern. But combining my room for optimism is sort of combining things that Katie and Will said to just sort of put a finer point on this being a sort of focal moment, creating an opportunity for more focus and sort of empowering the larger community of those who are really dedicated to work on these issues. Because when it comes down to it, right, there's nothing like trial by fire to unite people, right, who are facing this all together, right? We need, in some unfortunate ways, these sorts of attacks, these sorts of pressures bring people together, right? There is community that can be found in strife. And so what I'm seeing is that researchers, trust and safety workers, right, others who've been in this space for a long time and maybe just didn't talk to one another very much about their larger concerns and how they might work together and coordinate and support one another, are really truly coming together and finding community in the commitment to continuing to do the good work. That's what has me encouraged.
Right. Will.
I think Will went, but I think I can close this out and we'll do audience Q&A. But you have all given me new things to worry about, but also new ways to assuage my fears. So thank you for that. I think the thing that my nightmare scenario is that the specter of political violence hasn't passed, right? That there will be, between continuing denial of the 2020 election, continuing distrust in our election officials, and the various court challenges that involve the former president, that there will be a raised temperature around this election that puts us again at risk of political violence, and that because of the toxic political atmosphere, we'll be caught flat-footed in terms of how we mitigate that risk and how we respond to it. That, as Katie said, these platform policies around the election will be living, breathing policies. How will they decide the edge cases? Will they be able to decide them in ways that take us further from that risk, or will we continue to lurch toward it? Will researchers and government be able to do their work in ways that help protect us from the risk of violence? That I think is a sort of broad, open question that I worry on a lot. But in terms of signs of hope, it would have been easy, given the political environment now and the relatively peaceful outcome of the 2022 elections, to say, maybe resources for this work can be drawn down. And when I talk to people in this field, they say, no, absolutely not. We're doubling down. We're still in this. We're still fundraising around this work. It's still being supported. And more long-term, you see, I think, resilient concern around the health of U.S. democracy, right? You see things like a half a, I think it was $500 billion in investment in local media from philanthropy just recently announced from the Press Forward initiative. You see huge investments in new resource centers. We might not call these things counter disinformation going forward, but they are investments in the health of our information environment. And I don't think that funders, that government, that civil society are going to stop somehow worrying about these threats. They're really committed, no matter how the politics shakes out.
Great. Let me pose a couple of questions from the audience. There are a couple of questions I'm going to combine that really are directed to you, I think, Rebecca, which is researcher access to data. You mentioned that there's some requirements in Brussels, and I think that the thrust of the question is how much of a Brussels effect do you think there's going to be in terms of that researcher access to data, in terms of its spread across the rest of the world? And two, to what degree do you think that will encompass civil society and other folks beyond just the academic research community?
Yeah, so to be clear, the Digital Services Act requirement for researcher access includes civil society as well as researchers. There's a question mark around what role journalists have in all of this, but it is pretty clear that civil society researchers are included, not just academics. Do I think that there is going to be a larger European effect on data access? I have some hope. But honestly, we've got to get the European stuff figured out first and make sure that that functions reasonably and sensibly before we worry too much about what else can be done elsewhere. There have definitely been signs that some other administrations are interested in sort of following on, particularly in a voluntary capacity. But I think it's a little bit too soon for us to know what the potential knock-on effects may be, just primarily because things in the European Union aren't fully stood up yet.
Great. Well, we're right at our 2 o'clock mark, so I think I might bring things to a close. Thank you so much for this really engaging and interesting discussion. I mean, these issues are very live and are going to continue to be, I think, of great public attention going forward. So this will not by any means be the last of these conversations, and a lot more work to be done here, both in terms of the election research and in figuring out ways to support election researchers. So thanks again. Appreciate everyone's time. Thanks to the audience for joining us, and look forward to